diagram and analogy in the confluence of Peirce's and Deleuze's ideas, implications of the semiotic education interface. On semiotics education interfaces. What interfaces between Peircean semiotics and education can we delineate? We will point out two possibilities, a wide one and a more specific one. To do so, we take semiotics or logic, the third classification of normative science, in its first branch, speculative grammar, for allowing the investigation of the ways in which the most differentiated processes of language are engendered and function communicatively and culturally. The diagram for the classification of science enables the location of such subdivisions. A wide interface. School subjects are languages. The speculative grammar provides definitions and classifications of signs involving the verbal and nonverbal, from which methodological strategies emerge for reading and analyze signs of the most diverse languages, such as school subjects, the products of advertising, cinema, music, literature, hypermedia, among others. Besides looking at the school subjects as a language modality and also considering that the media products permeate the educational environment and therefore can be used to compose educational practices. We defend the importance that educators, in general, know the mentioned analysis strategies. This would be the first contribution in a broader look to the speculative grammar. The application of analysis strategies implies the belief that thought in the human mind, in particular, occurs via science, or even with and in languages. The one who seeks to inventory the possible meanings engendered in the sign must be equipped with three types of gaze: contemplative, observational, and generalizing, based on the categories of Persian phenomenology. Such gazes, respectively, capture the qualitative aspects on the sign object, the referential, and those related to laws, rules, or norms shared in the culture where the interpreter is inserted. For example, the first look allows capturing the qualitative aspects, which, in a visual sign, are those linked to colors, shapes, lines, and textures, as well as the arrangement of these elements. The second look is for clues that lead the interpreter to existing aspects of the reality in which the object is inscribed. The third look is the one that collects symbolisms that impregnate the object and, in a certain way, is linked to the cultural context in which the object becomes a sign. With such strategy, it is possible to remove the layers that cover the signs. However, it is worth remembering that these ways of looking constitute general schemes for thought and, as such, do not abstain from specific knowledge of the language under analysis, whether sound, visual, or verbal. Thus, under such perspective, we can analyze school subjects as differentiate modes of language, as well as media processes and products in general. Mathematics or biology, as examples, require different modes of representation from the world. By expanding the scope of taking advantage of speculative grammar, education practices may focus on the process of construction of the signs. A specific interface. The second interface contemplated in this article comes from a more specific look at the classifications of signs, which contributes to details, aspects, and help the understanding of how the action of certain signs happens or how they trigger cognition in the mind of the interpreter. Here, we look at the diagram from Deleuze and Peirce's perspectives. Deleuze mentions Peirce's ideas in Pintura, el concepto del diagrama. He makes use of painting and proposes that the presentness, emerges with the diagrams. He explains that the diagram's function is to undo similarities or to search for deep similarities from where the images, the figures arise. Painting seeks to undo representation in order to make present emerge. Representation in this moment before painting. Presence is what comes out of the diagram, with and thus the similarity to give way to presence, the pictorial fact. The diagram operates chaotically with the visual data, and from this movement or tension of this possibility or the fact, the pictorial fact emerges. The diagram in action makes the object present, with also implies relations between the analog and the digital. Deleuze explains that with analogical language, it is also possible to reproduce and produce things. He defines analogy as a principle of reproducing resemblance and emphasizes that there are three types. The first, common knowledge, carries out the conveyance of similitude relation. For this first type, the model is the mood. Thus, the molding imposes a similitude which comes from outside. For example, I put a clay mold on the clay. What do I hope? I hope that the clay, under the impression of the mold, has reached a position of equilibrium. It is an operation of edge of surface. The second analogy involves the notion of operation with an inner mode, a module. With it, modeling is done. The third type, modulation, involves a modulator. The mode and the modulator are extreme cases, but the essential operation of the acquisition of form is carried out in the same way. That is, it consists in the establishment of an energy regime, durable or not. The molding consists in modulating in a definitive way. The modular is shaped continuously and is perpetually variable. Between the two, I say there is something and call it modern. In a summarized way, we would have analogy by similitude, analogy by relation, by internal relation, and analogy by modulation. The analogy groups three cases: the mood, the module, and the modulation. And it would be a growing series. In modulation, there is no transport of qualitative similitude, mood-like operation. There is not simply module, transport of internal relation, but the production of similitude by non-similar. Non-similar means which institute the presence of the figure. Let us now see the iconic signs or hypoicons iconic scene signs, observing the diagram below in the Persian perspective. They are of three modalities: image, diagram, and metaphor. The images suggest the objects by similarity based on their appearance. The diagram demands a similitude when presenting the relations between the parts of its object, using analogous relation in its own parts. And the metaphor suggests the object by means of comparison between meanings of a distinct object from the one that is suggested. It is worth emphasizing that any kind of representation, visual or not, that provides on itself relations analogues of those of their objects suggested is called diagram, and the similarity between sign and the object is the similarity between structure relations shared by the sign and the object and are not on the surface as the similarity of the images. Image. Peirce points out that a great distinctive property of the icon is that, by direct observation of it, other truth about its objects may be discovered besides those which surface to determine its construction, and that, in this case, applies also to the diagram. But there is an aspect that needs to be observed, since the movement of thought in a diagram always involves conventional signs. About this, Peirce warns that any material in image, like a painting, is largely conventional in its mode of representation, but in itself, without caption or labels, it may be called hypoicon. Thus, it is necessary to think about the imbrication of the analog with conventional signs, which was not disregarded by Peirce. The similarity relations in these signs are permeated by such conventional signs, symbols. Deleuze mentions that Peirce defined the diagram, availing himself of the similarity by internal relations, which would imply the link of this type of sign with the second type of analogy. However, observing the figure 2, that shows the diagram as a modality of icon, there is no way not to say that Peirce would not have, by other ways, considered the idea of modulation. This because the icon in action corresponds to the idea that the object becomes present. But how to use the types of analogy to classify infographics and concept maps? Such a classification goes beyond the composition of the visual representation, here the infographics and concept maps. The cognitive and communicative potential of the infographic can be established when compared to the text, the verbal, because it anticipates a possible diagram that the interpreter would elaborate with semiosis. The wonder of language lies in the fact that it provokes forgetfulness, because the interpreter very quickly abandons the form, the sound of the word, part of its iconicity, and walks towards meanings, that is, takes the word as a symbol. In the sense, the infographic shows relations between data, softening the strain of meanings at first to draw relation between data. The meanings of the words come after the model. The visual representation, the play of shapes, colors, and textures that make up infographics offer additional information and encourage concentrated attention by marking important points in spatial arrangement, which leads the interpreter to make conjectures, assumptions. The mode of representation should be analogous to the spatial analogical mental model required to understand the content, because it can operate the reconstruction of a model while the use of verbal language is required. Initially, the construction of a diagrammatic representation of a content, then comes the elaboration of a spatial analogical model. Using the three types of analogy proposed by Deleuze, we would have the levels of infographics represented in the following figures. We would then have first level infographics when the common analogy prevails. Second level infographics when the second type of analogy prevails. And level 3 when there is a preponderance of codes over the analogical. The concept map, by drawing how a concept is constructed and the relations it may establish with the elements that compose it or of a subject, involves several concepts, may be considered a diagram. Its function would be to make present the concept or the subject. Thus, it is seen that the possibility of a diagram to reveal aspects of a concept or subject depends on the manipulation of its structure. That is, a diagram can present the object or bring it to the surface or make it present through its manipulation by an interpreter. Examples of concept maps based on these relations follow. Concept map, first level diagram, classification of signs prepared by Peirce. Concept map, second level diagram, the 10 classes of signs in the taxonomy proposed by Peirce. Concept map, the third type of analogy prevails, greater overlapping of codes, symbols. This taxonomy is significant for communication as well as for education, as it shows how thought occurs with such visual representations, going beyond their composition in the mixture between verbal and visual languages. The same occurs with concept maps, which shows how and what depth cognition involves the concept or the subject displayed in the concept map. Thank you very much. Obrigada.